Welcome back, Agriscience. We are going to finish up with environmental science this week. We're going to take a look at wildlife, we're going to take a look at forestry, and then make sure that you're familiar with some of the tools that are used in the environmental science industry. So, first of all, let's take a look at wildlife management today. Whenever we're looking at wildlife management, we are looking at the animals that live in a particular area, not domesticated animals, but those animals that live in the wild, that are surviving off of the land or wherever they're staying. There are a lot of benefits to actually having wildlife, and one of them is just specifically recreational. We as a we as a species can go to the grocery store and we can pick up our food, but there are a lot of people that enjoy the opportunity to go out and catch or shoot their own food. So hunting and fishing is a huge part of wildlife and a big benefit to those people who use it recreationally. Viewing, some people just really like to sit and watch wildlife. And along with that, photography, potentially taking pictures of wildlife. And for some of these things, some of the wildlife are what we call an environmental indicator, because if a particular type of animal disappears, then it could be an indicator that you have something going on in a particular area. There's that you're lacking something. So these wildlife can be an indicator as to what's going on with a particular habitat or area. If we're looking at different wildlife environments, most of the time when you see wildlife, you don't see them in the middle of the city. I'm not saying that there's not, you know, a random weird case of seeing something in the city, but most of the time, whenever you see wildlife, you see them in your more rural areas. Typically on a farm. A lot of times you see them on farms because there's a lot of things that are left over whenever a crop is harvested, or even before the crop is harvested. You might have issues with wildlife getting in and eating the crops that you planted. So a lot of times, if you have wildlife, it's a byproduct of what you're doing. Because you actually are providing a food source and potentially a habitat for different types of wildlife. If you have never been around a field of corn that is being harvested, there will be mice and rats that come out of those fields of corn or wheat or soybeans or whatever, because they're living in there and they're living off of those crops. Once you cut it, once you harvest it, there will be some left behind. There'll be some residue left behind, and we'll look at some crop residue pictures in a few minutes. But there'll be some crop residue that's left behind, and that's a great food source for those wildlife to come back in. Brush piles, also, rabbits a lot of times will find a place that's quiet to have babies, and then you see them in brush piles and things like that. So farms are great opportunity for animals to find a habitat. Forest, it is much more difficult to manage wildlife in a forest. If you are doing wildlife stuff, wildlife conservation on a farm, you can kind of control what you have there, because you can decide whether or not you actually want to leave the crop residue. You can decide whether or not you want to have the brush piles available for animals to be able to use those as a habitat. Forests are a lot more difficult to manage because they're ever changing. You've got storms that cause trees to fall. You have got issues with rain and flooding that sometimes causes creeks to rise and streams to rise, which causes a change in the landscape. Forests are much more difficult to manage just because um, you're not purposely leaving things in the woods most of the time. Um, Wetlands, we don't have a whole lot of issues with wetlands in this particular area where I'm from in the eastern part of the state. There were a lot of swamps, and so it is very difficult to manage anything in those swamps because it is so wet and it's hard to get any kind of equipment or anything else in there, and you wouldn't want to get any equipment in there to fix or do anything to it. So wetland areas are going to be huge environmental habitats for different types of wildlife. And you're not necessarily just looking at deer and the cute things. Sometimes you're looking at things like snakes and alligators and stuff like that too. A couple of other types of environments. You've got streams. These again, they're difficult to manage because they're constantly flowing, they're constantly changing. We have a creek behind our house, and every time I go down there, it looks a little bit different, just because of what kind of rain we've gotten. And how much rain we've gotten and how quickly we've gotten it. So it always looks a little bit different. It's very difficult to manage that. Ponds and lakes are pretty easy to manage as compared to something that is a flowing type of water, because you actually do not have a source coming in and out of the pond. So since it's not flowing, usually those ponds and lakes, you can do a little bit more management of those. Backyards, sometimes people just, they use their backyards as a wildlife environment. They set things out so that they can actually watch the things that are going on near their house, and they'll leave little bird seeds and they'll leave out hummingbird feeders because they like to watch the wildlife. So in in a rural or even an urban setting, you can still see some of those wildlife, even if you are not necessarily on a farm. You can fix your backyard so that you actually can draw in some of the wildlife. These next couple slides are looking a little bit at aquaculture, and one thing that you're going to have an opportunity this semester to work with is our aquaculture system. Aquaculture, basically, we are looking at the use of fish and the waste from fish to fertilize a hydroponic system where we can actually grow plants. And so it's kind of like a fish and plant relationship, which seems totally weird, but it actually works out pretty well. Sometimes some aquaponic systems use trout. We are not going to be able to use trout because you have to keep the water too cold, and because our aquaponic system is in the greenhouse, it is going to be much warmer than what a trout would prefer as far as their environment. We will be raising catfish, and some of you were asking about that the other day. We have contacted the guy who does the hatchery, and we are going to hopefully be getting some catfish pretty soon. We are looking at getting about 20 that will start out between 6 and 8 inches long, and that will be what we start with. They're a pretty hardy breed. They're easy to work with, and they are less likely to cause us difficulties as first-time aquaponics growers. I guess that's a good way to put it. Some people use bass. This is a largemouth bass. You can see how large the mouth is, hence the name largemouth bass. And some also use tilapia. Tilapia is also a good first type of fish for an aquaponic system. But we just decided to start with the catfish because we could get those for free. We may eventually do tilapia, just not as our starting project. So one thing we have to consider when we're doing that, and this is not just with our tank, but this is in general, we have to consider what's called the carrying capacity. You have to make sure you have room for everybody. You have to make sure that you have resources for everybody. One time we were, long time ago, we went on a field trip, and this was years ago whenever we actually used to do reward field trips for people paying their FFA membership. Everybody gets to be an FFA member without having to pay membership now. But we went to Golden Corral for lunch one day, and some students decided they had a little extra time. They walked over to Fins and Critters, and I had like a 5-gallon fish tank at the time. It wasn't a very big fish tank, and I didn't have anything in it because I just had not gone to get anything to put in it. But it was set up, it was ready to go, and some of those students decided to go and get me some fish while they were at Fins and Critters. These are feeder fish, so they were like 8 for $1, and they're used to feed bigger fish. So it wasn't, super expensive type of fish or anything like that. But about 3 or 4 students decided to get me those 8 fish. And so you're looking at 25, 30 plus fish in a 5-gallon tank. I can tell you what happened the next day is I came in and there were a bunch of fish that were floating, and it's just because the space wasn't there. Carrying capacity is just how much can you put in an area and expect that environment to support it. So when we look at how many fish we want to put in our aquaponics system, we're going with 20. We don't want to get too many because we don't want it to cause issues. When you have too much wildlife in an area, it causes malnutrition because there's not enough food for them to eat. It can cause disease because they are starting to get weak, and those diseases, because of the malnutrition, those diseases pass on to others, and you're just looking at a lot of major issues if you have too many in an area. So too much of a good thing is sometimes not a good thing. So that habitat quality is going to decrease. It's going to be messier and dirtier and hard to keep clean. So carrying capacity is just, we want to consider how much we're putting on land. You can see this picture right here. This is because of deer overpopulation. This is what we call a browse line. And you can see that the deer have basically eaten as far up as they actually can on those trees. And so when you get to a point that you have so many that you have a browse line, you probably have got too many in an area. So this is just an example of what you can use as an indicator that there's overpopulation. There is something to do that we can help with that. And so that's the reason why whenever you get ready to go and hunt, you have to get deer tags. That's the reason why you can't just go out and fish without a fishing license. Licenses help to be able to regulate the carrying capacity, because you're looking at not overkilling, but maintaining a proper population in an area. So hunting and fishing license and the regulation of that do help to make sure that we are not killing more than we need to, but that we are controlling the population. One of the things that also helps, and I already mentioned that before, is crop residue. When you leave that crop residue behind, that is a good area for wildlife to come in and actually be able to forage for food. So that's one thing that you can do if you're looking to have wildlife in your area, is leave that crop residue, leave it behind for them to be able to eat, and then you don't have to worry about cleaning it up, but you also might have some wildlife to look at. As far as some of the examples of wildlife in North Carolina, a lot of our species that are hunted, you've got deer, which are obviously the one that most people are going out and looking for. You've got ducks and bear, rabbits. Around here, a lot of people hunt turkeys. So you have those hunted species there. Some other examples of songbirds. You've got cardinals, robins, bluebirds. You've also, this one, it's kind of hard to love these because they're kind of ugly and they're kind of gross. But the birds of prey do actually have a really important role in what we do, because they do help to clean things up. They help to come behind after things have been killed or passed away, and they help to clean those things up. And then some of the other examples, we already mentioned some of the fish that you will sometimes see. Got a couple of pictures here. You've got a a cardinal there. That was one of those songbirds. You got a red-tailed hawk. We have several of these in this area. I hear them quite often near my house, and it's close, so we see these quite a bit. And then got a vulture there, and we see lots and lots of vultures in this area. For some reason, there used to be an abundance of vultures, and there may still be, in Boiling Springs near the water tower. Not really sure why we had so many vultures in Boiling Springs, but anyway, just some examples of some of the wildlife that you might see. If you have any questions, make sure that you ask. Next time we will talk about forest and forest management.